He arrived in New York City with one suit of clothing and with $1 in his pocket. He was ordained a Roman Catholic priest 3 weeks later. That's how the American journey began for Saint John Neumann. But his life's journey began earlier than that in Europe. He was born in 1811 in the Kingdom of Bohemia. Where he was born is now modern-day Czech Republic. As a young man, he was interested in astronomy and in botany. He had enough fluency for languages. He was able to speak 6 of them by the time he was 24 years old. But he wanted to be a priest. That's what he felt God was calling him to do. And so he went to the seminary. He studied hard. And when the time came for ordination, the bishop looked at him and said, "I'd like to ordain you, but we have too many priests in Bohemia. I don't have any assignments for all these men who want to be priests." Now, fast forward to our own time. I can't imagine that, saying we're having no ordinations because there are too many priests and not enough assignments. But in mid-19th century Bohemia, that's what was going on. And so he made the arrangements, John Neumann did, because he really wanted to be a priest, to travel to the United States and to go to the Archdiocese of New York and be ordained a priest for them. At the time that he arrived, the Archdiocese of New York took in the entire state of New York as well as part of New Jersey. And so his first assignment was in Western New York. But it's not like now you'd go to a town and there's one town and that's where you're the parish priest. He was a whole geographic area that was in his charge. And his territory was from Lake Ontario all the way to the border of Pennsylvania. So in order to meet people and to serve them and to say Mass for them, he had to travel by horseback from town to town. Now, apparently when he arrived in town, especially the first times, it was a comical sight, because John Neumann was not tall, and his feet did not reach the stirrups when he was sitting on the horse, so apparently this was a comical sight as he entered into the town. But soon people came to love him because he was an effective preacher, he was a kind and considerate and compassionate priest, and he served people as best he could, given these very unusual circumstances. The challenge for him was this, that he was very lonely. It was a very isolating life. And so he asked the bishop, the Archbishop of New York, could he please join a religious order so he would have companions in his ministry. And he was given permission to join the Redemptorist order. And then he began to serve in Redemptorist parishes with other members of the order in spreading the good news and caring for people in his new country. He would eventually wind up serving in Maryland, and he would then be named the provincial for the Redemptorists here in the United States. But he wasn't the provincial superior in this country for very long, because a year later, in 1852, he was named the Archbishop of Philadelphia. Now, at the time that he was named the Archbishop of Philadelphia, that archdiocese took in most of Pennsylvania and included part of New Jersey. And where we live right now in central New Jersey, the Diocese of Metuchen, we were part of his jurisdiction when he became bishop. There are many European immigrants that were settling in the Philadelphia area at the time of his becoming bishop. And so John Neumann's knowledge of languages helped him because many of these immigrants knew little, if any, English. And this made him a very effective bishop. He spoke to the people in languages that they understood. He spoke from the language of the heart, but he also knew their native tongue. And so there were many Italian immigrants who were facing a lot of difficulties. He was able to care for them because he spoke their language. He also spoke Gaelic, and it was interesting that one woman was reported to say that when she heard him speak, she thought he was from Ireland. And she thought, oh, thank goodness, we finally have an Irish bishop here. That's how well he was able to speak. But he also spoke, again, as I said, to people's hearts. And he helped them understand God's love for them and how God was calling them in their own time. But there were many challenges that he faced as the Archbishop of Philadelphia. There was a great challenge regarding immigration. This may sound familiar to us now. there was no interest in Philadelphia for those who had been born in this country for these European immigrants coming in. There was a political party known as the Know Nothings who had their headquarters in Philadelphia. They were anti-immigration, they were anti-Catholic, huge bigotry and prejudice they were promulgating throughout the city and throughout our country at that time. So to strengthen the Catholic population, which was primarily immigrants, Saint John Neumann developed the Catholic school system. He developed a lot of social services for people to help them in their need. He did all that he could to stand with them and to help them live their faith as well as live their desire to be part of this country and to contribute and to receive benefits from being in this country. He brought many religious orders from Europe to help. Many religious congregations of women started here because of his invitation to help with the social services as well as the education of families. John Neumann was a very frugal guy. He only owned one pair of boots his entire time that he lived in the United States. And if you gave him a new vestment as bishop, he never wore it. He always gave it to the newly ordained of the archdiocese. Now, John Neumann was a great man, and he was also very discouraged by what he saw. The anti-Catholic riots that were taking place, the arson of Catholic churches and rectories and convents. And at one point, he actually wondered, am I the right guy for this job? He actually wrote Pius IX, who was the Pope at the time, and said, do you think maybe you chose the wrong person? Should I offer you my resignation? And Pius IX said, no, you are the right man for this. And at one point John Neumann led a pilgrimage to Rome, and the Pope again said to him, no, you are the right man to help these new immigrants, to help this new church grow in this country. On January the 5th, 1860, John Neumann was doing his regular chores, his errands of the day. He collapsed in the streets of Philadelphia, and he died. Pope Paul VI beatified him in 1963 during the Second Vatican Council, and later the same Pope in 1977 canonized him a saint, making him the first United States citizen, male citizen, to be canonized a saint. I think the voice of Saint John Neumann says a lot to us, especially in the times that we are living. He would have a lot to say to us about prejudice, about disdain for immigrants, about concern for the poor, about the lack of social services and education for many, about how it is important to understand people's language and culture in creating unity. He would understand that this is what Christ is calling us to, and that we have to do the hard work of evangelization and solidarity with those in need. He was only bishop for about 5 years, and the reality was that he was often very discouraged when he saw these riots taking place, when he saw the prejudice and the terrible, terrible things that people were doing to one another. He really felt a great despair. I would suspect in this day and age we might say there were a couple moments that he was actually depressed. One of his prayers actually reveals this. He writes this: "My Jesus, banish the demon of despair. My devotion has vanished, my tears are dried up, thoughts of my angel and my patron no longer soothe my troubled soul. Thy remembrance, my Savior, grows dim before my mental gaze. O Jesus, do not forsake me. Help me, help me." It was the Eucharist that helped John Neumann to continue on in the midst of difficulties. He started 40 hours devotion, adoration to the Blessed Sacrament in that archdiocese, and popularized that in the United States. But it was the Eucharist, the table that we are called to, the true presence of Christ, that unified him, strengthened him, and helped him to face another day when there were many difficulties on the street. I believe that John Neumann would tell us to look to the Eucharist, especially in these challenging days of return, in the uncertainty of what's happening in our country, and in the months ahead. He would tell us that it is the devotion to the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist that will help us to find the grace, to strengthen us, and to have that vision, to see we are not going to give up hope, that we will not let prejudice and disdain for immigrants, the lack of concern for the poor, or the lack of understanding people different from us, we're not going to let that destroy the unity that John Neumann saw in the church and that he saw was part of the tradition and the history of this country. He believed that every single person was called by God. In fact, at one point he writes this: "Everyone who breathes, high and low, educated and ignorant, young and old, man and woman, has a mission, has a work. We are not sent into this world for nothing." He writes, God sees every one of us. He creates every soul for a purpose. He needs every one of us. He has an end for every one of us. We are equal in his sight, and we are placed in our different ranks and stations, not to get what we can out of them for ourselves, but to labor in them for him. As we now continue on into the summer, as we return to the Eucharist, may we hear the voice of John Neumann, who understood very much the language of love, the language of compassion, the language of the gospel. May people hear that language in us.